Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the fourth episode of our Coastal Estuary webinar series. My name is Kristen, and I'm the coordinator for Rain Coast Lower Fraser Salmon Conservation Program. So before we get going today, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I live and I'm calling in from the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation and people who have lived here since time immemorial. And as per usual for all of our episodes, for those of you who are joining us today, please feel free to introduce yourselves and where you're calling in from in the chat box provided. And as a quick reminder, you're also welcome to submit any questions you may have for our guests throughout the episode, and we'll get to them during the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar. So for today's episode, we're really going to be building off of the knowledge we've acquired in our previous episodes, which focused on the importance of the Fraser Estuary to Indigenous nations, Pacific salmon, and southern resident killer whales. So today we'll discuss the future of the estuary and what this will look like under a changing climate. So specifically, we'll learn about the threats climate change pose to the estuary, as well as surrounding communities, and the role this ecosystem can play in adapting to climate change. So we'll discuss how innovative nature-based solutions projects can support ecological resilience in the face of uncertainty. So the arc of today's episode will follow a quick recap on why the estuary is an important ecosystem to a variety of species, and the extensive modifications of the estuary that has occurred since colonial contact, as well as some of the current flood infrastructure that we have in place. And we'll talk about the effects of climate change and what this means for habitats within the estuary, and the current innovative solutions that are taking place to address these challenges. And really a core theme of today's episode will be the importance of collaboration as well as creativity across sectors to ensure our ecosystems and communities adapt to climate change. So our two guests today will talk in depth about how the current status quo of managing for flooding can really impede our adaptation to climate change. And they'll highlight some of the innovative solutions that are currently taking place, as well as some proposed projects that aim to address this gap. I'm really excited to welcome two guest speakers who are pushing the bar forward to implement nature-based solutions that will help the Fraser Estuary and surrounding communities adapt to a changing climate. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Debra Carlson, who is joining us now. So Debra is a staff lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law. She works with communities in BC to develop legal frameworks that support healthy and low-impact urban areas and community-based planning processes that start from our connection to the natural environment. So welcome, Deb. Thanks for joining us.
Can you hear me, Kristen?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay, thanks, because I can't actually hear you.
Oh, really? Okay. Let's see here. Let's bring on Eric and see if he can hear me as well. Eric, can you hear me?
Hi there. Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm wondering, Deb, if it's on your end. Let's see. Let's try removing you from the stream and coming back on. Any luck? Nope. Okay. Let me, I'm not sure. Maybe if you close StreamYard and restart, we can try that. It wouldn't be a virtual event without any technical disruptions. Eric, maybe we'll, I'll introduce you in your bio and then we can circle back and hopefully Deb can, sort out her things on her end if that's what's happening. So Deb, I'm just going to remove you from the stream and then we'll try and figure that out. So Eric, we are really excited to have you on today. So Eric is the coordinator of the South Coast Conservation Land Management Program. He leads the collaborative management of over 37,000 hectares of provincial conservation land throughout the south coast of BC in partnership with the province of British Columbia, Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Nature Trust of BC, as well as the Canadian Wildlife Service. Eric earned a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of British Columbia, as well as a Master's of Science in Ecological Restoration from Simon Fraser University and the British Columbia Institute of Technology. And during the latter degree, he studied the causes of ongoing tidal marsh throughout the Fraser River Delta Front. And Eric continues that research today as project leader of the Sturgeon Bank Marsh Recession Project. So Eric, it's great to have you. And I think, yeah, Deb is restarting. So maybe while we're waiting for her, we can just launch into some of the questions that I was hoping to ask you and get a sense of your work. So a question that I've been asking our participants before we get going is just to kind of get a better understanding of how you arrived in the Fraser Estuary. So just to kind of really ground us in the estuary, which is the place we're talking about today. So I'm wondering if you could describe the path you took to get to the estuary and how it led into the work you're doing today.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, just trying to figure out how far back I should go. It's kind of crazy thinking that I'm a biologist, even though I never took a biology course in high school. So definitely been a bit of a circuitous route. But long story short, I I decided to focus my career after doing a bunch of different things related to biology. I actually was studying orangutans in a jungle in Indonesia, and when I emerged from the jungle, I'm like, okay, I think it's time for grad school. So I, as Kristen mentioned, went into the BCIT SFU Ecological Restoration Master's Program. And long story short, I was at a conference one day, and the presenter was talking about this tidal marsh recession in the Fraser Estuary. And he made the mistake at the end of his presentation to say, oh yeah, and we have money if anybody wants to do some work with us. And I mean, that's music to my ears. So I just made a beeline over there, and the rest is history. I joined Sean Boyd from Environment Canada and Brent Gerd from the province with their investigation into this massive amount of tidal marsh loss throughout the Fraser Estuary. And I was able, for my graduate degree, to do some experiments for them to try to figure out, what has caused this recession. And I was very fortunate that they hired me on afterward to continue my master's research, and then I found my way into my current position where I now get to manage the provincial conservation lands, these wildlife management areas where the marsh recession has been occurring. So for me, it's quite the full circle thing there, and I still, in my current capacity, I get to lead the ongoing marsh recession investigation. So definitely very, very happy how it's worked out for me. And I live in Delta too, so it feels like the estuary is my backyard, shall we say.
Yeah, totally. Okay, great. That was really helpful in just kind of painting the picture of how you arrived in the estuary and doing the work you do now. And I think Deb is still working out her end, so we'll just keep on going, and then we can circle back and ask her how she arrived here. So I just want to kind of open up our discussion and provide some context, and again, just ask some kind of overarching questions before we get into the details of some of the projects that you work on. So can you describe the importance of the Fraser Estuary to different species? And this can include, both vegetation and other species, but just the importance.
Yeah, for sure. If you don't mind popping up my slides there.
Sure.
So this here is a series of images of how the delta has formed over time. So as of 10,000 years ago, when the glacier started melting, the Fraser River started delivering all of these sediments to the delta front. So you can see that the red dot is the present location of Steveston in Richmond there. And then as the years go on, you can see these yellow deltaic sediments from the river. They start to build up and form the delta. And now it starts to recognize the shape that we see it in today. So you're familiar with Vancouver, Richmond, Delta, and you get a sense of just how long in the making this has been. And one of the crazy things here is that actually different First Nations folks have been present for the entire lifespan of the Fraser Delta. There's actually an old archaeological site here just close to the Alex Fraser Bridge. And so we know that these these people, through their oral history, they recall the entire lifespan of the delta, which is kind of crazy. And so here we have a satellite image, and you can see that the Fraser River, it splits off into the north and middle arm, and through those two arms, it's about 12% of the river's water flows, but nearly 88% of the river's water goes through the main arm and Canoe Pass, but nearly 100% of the sediment goes through those areas. And so because of that, we've had the river and the delta form a variety of ecosystems, a range of tidal environments, including mudflats, eelgrass meadows, and tidal marshes. So start off just looking at the mud and sand flats here. You can see these are very expansive areas outside the dike. And the crazy thing is, this is not just mud. They may look empty, but they're host to a multitude of marine invertebrates that support migratory birds and other species. In particular, there's this biofilm stuff. So biofilm, it's a dense mucus-like layer that forms on mud and is created by bacteria and diatoms that settle out of seawater and secrete mucus that binds them to the mud so they don't wash away with the tide. And believe it or not, but this biofilm is actually food for birds like western sandpipers that rely upon it to refuel for their lengthy migrations up and down the Pacific coast. And this next one here is actually a video I took out of the west coast of Westham Island at the interface between and you can see here just how, like I said, how expansive it is. It looks like there's no slope. It looks like it just goes on forever and forever. So you can imagine just for the mud flats, how much biofilm there could be there, how many marine invertebrates there are out there, and how gorgeous of a spot it is, really. And so you also see those tidal marshes there. So if we could swap back to my presentation.
There we go.
There we go. Perfect. Actually, so next I'll just briefly mention Eelgrass Meadows. So we have tidal and subtidal eelgrass meadows, primarily in Boundary Bay and some parts of Roberts Bank. And these areas, they are host to a wide range of marine invertebrates and are a nursery for many species of fish. As well, these eelgrass meadows, they help to sequester carbon from the atmosphere into the sediments. So they're storing carbon there. That's blue carbon. As well, eelgrass actually slows down waves so that the waves aren't as high and dissipates wave energy. And then lastly, I know we're not supposed to play favorites, but the tidal marshes are my favorites in the Fraser Estuary here. So in the green polygons here, we have tidal marshes along the delta front that also attenuate wave energy, thus actually adding to the protection of our shorelines in addition to the dikes. And the tidal channels and tidal marshes are important for many species of fish, including millions of outmigrating salmon. These marshes sequester large amounts of carbon, and then the plants themselves, the rootstocks and the seeds, are food for shorebirds and migratory birds. Oh, I just got these two images here. And so the crazy thing here is that the Fraser River is actually the largest salmon-bearing river in Canada, and the estuarine habitats play an important role for outmigrating juvenile Pacific salmon. So potentially hundreds of millions of Pacific salmon rely upon the estuary as they're migrating from freshwater into the ocean there. As well, the Fraser Delta is the last major stop along the Pacific flyby migratory bird route up to the Arctic. So as such, it is one of the most important areas for wintering and migratory birds in Canada. And the Delta is designated as an important bird and biodiversity area. It is a site of hemispheric importance for shorebirds, and it is a Ramsar wetland of international importance. So really, it doesn't get better than this. This is easily one of the most important sites throughout the Fraser, throughout British Columbia, for that matter. And fortunately, we have a wide range of provincial conservation lands, these wildlife management areas that encompass and protect many of these areas, in addition to some other sites such as the Alaxon National Wildlife Area and the Burns Bog Conservation Area.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, thanks so much for giving that presentation. It really sets the stage for the importance of the estuary and surrounding areas. And we're going to be talking more in depth about Sturgeon Bank and Roberts Bank, which Eric mentioned. But I see that Deb is back online with us. Deb, just to confirm, can you hear me now? No? Oh, no.
Yes, no, I can hear
Oh,
you.
you
I just
can.
realized I had mute on.
Mute. Okay, perfect. Great. So, Eric, we'll come back to the thread you were getting into because I have some follow-up questions. But now that Deb is back, I just want to welcome her and ask her the similar question that I did to you. So, Deb, what we've been doing with our guests who sign on is really just asking about their pathways to the work that they're involved with now. So how they got involved in the Fraser Estuary and surrounding area. So if you could just, tell us about your background and how you got to the work you do now, that'd be really great.
Sure. Well, I think you probably had an intro, which I unfortunately didn't hear. I guess you introduced me as a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. I've been working there for about 10 years. And when I started, I was working right away on climate adaptation. That was the file that was handed to me. And we're really interested in that as an environmental organization because of seeing the links between adaptation and resilience and, connecting with nature in a better way. And even in urban areas, which is kind of where I work, the areas where there are more people, but these are still natural areas, right? We're still on the earth, and sometimes it feels like we kind of forget that in cities and the way we design them. But I was working on climate change adaptation, and when we're thinking about reducing our climate impact and greenhouse gases, it's really a global scale, but climate adaptation really is happening even already at the local scale and the regional scale. So it's a slightly different focus. So we're dealing with these impacts. Some of the impacts we're facing are just kind of more of what we have, maybe greater risk of flood, greater risk of droughts in the summer, things like just a more intense version of what we know. Sea level rise, on the other hand, is quite different. We're not really used to the sea level rising. I mean, it has, of course, gone up and down, on a, in geological time, but not in the, in our lifetimes. It's not something that we would have, at least in past generations, expected to have seen. But now we have to prepare for it. And definitely when you think about things that are happening at a local level, like infrastructure, you're building something, you're kind of expecting it's going to be there for maybe, 50, 80, even 100 years. So it matters if we're going to have sea level rise of a meter. And as Eric has shown, much of the lower mainland, or the area where we have settled, is incredibly rich and diverse habitat. It was also very low, very close to the sea, and we're protected here by dikes. So that was kind of how we got involved in this conversation. I guess, like looking at the area, looking at the richness of the habitat that's there, and trying to think if there's a way to continue to live here in a good way, and manage sea level rise, basically. So that was kind of how we got involved in this, and then it's just gone on from there.
Great, thanks, Deb. And so you introduced some key topics that we're going to be talking about today, not only climate change, but the threats that climate change pose, including sea level rise and coastal squeeze. So I'll definitely ask you to kind of come back to those topics and describe them in more detail. But first, we're going to go to Eric now, and you both have painted a really great picture of the estuary and the context. And as Deb mentioned, there's been a lot of infrastructure that's been created. But for now, Eric, I'm wondering if you can talk about, we know the estuary has been highly modified with structures such as jetties. So I'm wondering first, we'll cover how these barriers affect the flow of the river and habitats like salt marsh and mudflats. And then we'll kind of come back to dikes with Deb, if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. If you don't mind popping up my slides there.
Sure.
Excellent. So you remember this image. So is clearly apparent from the satellite image, since settlers first set up the first colony in the lower Fraser River in 1827, we've just heavily modified the Fraser Delta through urbanization, agriculture, industrial development. I mean, we've built 4 cities on the Delta, in addition to Vancouver International Airport, the Tsawwassen Ferry Terminal, and Delta Port. Of course, the majority of the lower Fraser, all of these low-lying areas have been diked to prevent flooding. But the delta and river morphology has further been altered by dredging and river training structures, many of which are indicated in red here. So, for example, off the southwest coast of Richmond, the construction of the Steveston North Jetty took about 20 years to complete in 1932, and this almost 9-kilometer long rock wall trains the main arm of the Fraser River and diverts water and sediment away from Sturgeon Bank and out into the Strait of Georgia, as you can see from the massive sediment plume here in this satellite image. And so before we put in structures like that, the main arm of the river, it used to snake around kind of like an unrestrained fire hose, just flailing all over the place there. And so it's you can understand that, what is this? I guess that's almost 90 years of a legacy of having a structure like this in place. You can imagine that that's going to fundamentally alter the delivery of freshwater and sediments to these important foreshore ecosystems, and we'll have some big implications there with the resilience of these coastal ecosystems. And I just want to share one more quick image here. So this one here helps to illustrate these low-lying areas. So believe it or not, all of those teal areas are low-lying areas that are below sea level. And so they are protected by this vast network of dikes, all of these red lines that are protecting our communities in Metro Vancouver from the rising tides. And the crazy thing here is if you're going to stand on one of these dikes, the dry side of the dike, so like the land side of the dike, is actually lower in elevation than the salt marsh, the tidal ecosystems outside the dike. And that's largely because of how we've been managing the land and how the delta has continued to subside over the years there. But yeah.
Thanks, Eric, for that. And yeah, that's really helpful just to see the visuals of these types of infrastructures. Deb, I'm wondering if you could build off of that and just kind of describe, Eric really just kind of introduced this, but if you could expand on the role that dikes have played in the Lower Fraser and the Delta for protecting against flooding, and then what will happen with the onset of climate change and sea level rise and how these dikes interplay with sea level rise. I think you're on mute. Deb, I think you're on mute still.
Goodness. So this slide that Eric has put up is really helpful because I think you can see those green areas. Those are really low-lying areas, and pretty much all protected by dikes. We have about 120 kilometers of coastal dikes in the Lower Fraser that make life now possible. Essentially, we'd be, getting lots of tidal effects and storm effects otherwise. And then we have hundreds more kilometers of dikes on the Fraser River. And sometimes you don't even know the dikes are there unless you're looking for them, because they're not necessarily big gray walls. They're sometimes, just covered with the land. You might just see this gentle kind of berm shape at the coast, and that's a dike that's protecting us, and the urban and industrial development and the settlement that Eric has described. Of course, there are environmental impacts to that. In terms of cutting off the natural flow of the river and cutting off sediment delivery from the river to different areas. But as it stands, we have those dikes. Now, wonder if you could switch to my slide deck. That would be.
Yeah.
And if you could just go forward, there's a couple slides. There's a graph. That one, thank you. So this is what the provincial government has provided as guidance in terms of sea level rise. So we're looking at about possibly a meter of sea level rise by the year 2100 and continuing on from there. And I should note that there are actually, unfortunately, predictions that we might be facing more than a meter by 2100, but a meter is a lot. And in a storm, a meter translates sometimes to much more, like 3 or 4 meters difference of waves crashing in. So this is a significant issue for us, living with all these dikes around us. And we were having conversations about how to manage this with with local governments. And we are particularly getting interested in the area of Boundary Bay. And so if you go to the next slide, we're back to that, that high-level view. And Boundary Bay, as I think most people know, is the area that's between Point Roberts and then Crescent Beach on the other side. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Kristen, showing with the mouse there. And then you can kind of get a sense looking at this image as well. And Eric has already showed you of the of all the very valuable like marsh habitat that's around the Lower Fraser area. So what's going to happen then with this area being diked and sea level rise occurring over time? If you go to the next slide, this is a pretty good graphic from Ocean Watch, just showing what happens when you have a wall in place and the impact of a hard shoreline. So the water level is going to increase. And if there were no dikes, what we would see is the marsh area essentially migrating landwards, like that. The upper areas would then be converted to the habitat that's now at lower areas. But because we have dikes, there's really nowhere for the marsh to go. So it's going to just progressively drown over time if we leave things as they are. And it's going to take a while. It's going to take some decades. But ultimately, all that habitat is going to be lost in diked areas if we don't do anything. And this is a phenomenon that's often referred to as coastal squeeze. So we have a big coastal squeeze problem in the Lower Mainland, and particularly in Boundary Bay. And Kristen, I don't know if you want me to go any further at this stage, but that's essentially setting up the problem that we're facing, I guess.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Deb. And so I think you both have done a really great job at just kind of setting the context, the importance of the delta and the estuary, how it's changed over time with these man-made barriers that we've created, and the problems that we're facing today with a changing climate. So now I'd kind of like to move into discussing about the role nature-based solutions can play in addressing these threats. And so, Deb, maybe we can just continue with you. I know you've been involved in a project called The Living Dike, which is a collaborative project across many sectors. So perhaps you could start with giving us an overview of what nature-based solutions are, and then providing some details on living shorelines and the Living Dike project. And then Eric, we'll go over to you so you can describe your nature-based solutions projects. So Deb, if you'd like the presentation back up, I can pull it up if that works.
Yeah, that would be great. And if you could just go to the next slide, that'll probably work. Yeah, perfect. I love this image. Thank you, Gord McKenna, for making it available. So this is looking out at Boundary Bay, and you can also see Mount Baker, and it's a reminder of like the connection of all these places. This is what we're hoping to preserve, and Eric has already described all the ways that this is valuable habitat for fish and birds. But these marshes also provide a service, a very specific service to humans, and it's a flood regulation service. So when storms come in and waves come in, marshes really act to break the energy of the waves, and that's hugely helpful for having protection along the shoreline. It's like a big buffer zone. So if you just maybe go to the next slide, we'll just skip the complicated jurisdiction for a moment. So we have this idea kind of in theory when we were standing around Boundary Bay looking at the marsh, that it was helping the dikes. It was helping do the work of attenuating the wave energy that comes into Boundary Bay in certain storms. So we didn't have too much more to go on, though, because we didn't really have any examples of working actively with this. We were passively getting the benefits already from marshes in the Lower Fraser, but nobody had really done much investigation. So we reached out to the Environmental Defense Fund and an expert there, Shannon Cuniff. And she came up from the States, and she talked to us about the way that you can work with coastal systems to manage floods and to manage erosion. And there's been quite a bit of work done already in the States about this. And she even showed us this really great graphic from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which just shows how you can use a variety of responses to manage these types of risks at the coast. And it doesn't just have to be one thing. So you can have dikes, but maybe you don't have to have really high dikes. You don't have to have really intrusive dikes if you've got something to buffer the energy in front of the dikes. And so that was basically the idea. So we got a bunch of people together from across different regulatory agencies in the lower mainland, different authorities, and we had some workshops talking about these ideas and whether or not we could think of a way to go forward in Boundary Bay. And this is a picture of John Rechaw and Dan Bauman. Rechaw is a coastal engineer with about 40 years of experience, and Dan Bauman is a very experienced person doing restoration work over on Vancouver Island. And here they are in Boundary Bay, kind of discussing what might be the possibilities for working with nature here and helping the marsh adapt to sea level rise so that it can help us adapt to sea level rise as well. And they're having some pretty animated conversation, but the idea that emerged from this was, so we know that the marsh is going to be inundated and drown, as I mentioned earlier, if we don't do anything, because it hasn't got room to migrate landward. So the idea was maybe we can just elevate the marsh very gradually and help it get a bit higher over time, and gradually increase the slope up to the dike, just very, very, very gently, and in that way, the marsh will be able to adapt to sea level rise and will continue to benefit from the flood regulation services that it's providing, as well as all the amazing habitat values associated with the marsh. So that's basically the idea. I was going to say in a technical way, but I don't think anyone could confuse that with a technical explanation. But you know. That's the basic idea of a living dike, is working with the living marsh. And so there was a slide that was up earlier that I didn't get into, but the thing that we come down to, and this is, I guess, where West Coast environmental law comes in, is that the jurisdiction to do something like this is quite complicated. There's lots of different authorities that have just like one piece of what's needed. And so through lots of meetings and lots of collaboration and lots of great energy and a lot of people doing things just a little bit outside their normal scope of work, it ended up with a partnership of the city of Surrey, the city of Delta, and Semiahmoo First Nation successfully getting funding from Infrastructure Canada to work on some pilot projects for the living dike in Boundary Bay. And this is the announcement with Federal Minister Quattro as well being there. So that's where we're at now. We're just at the stage of looking at how to design those pilot projects.
Great. Thanks, Deb. Yeah,
if I could just emphasize, this is such a cool opportunity and such a unique partnership here. The fact that these partners were able to get millions of dollars to try this idea in a pilot project. It's phenomenal, and the fact that local governments and First Nations can lead it, all the better.
Absolutely, yeah, it's really leading the charge in this way. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Deb, for that. That was, a great presentation and really just gave us an excellent overview of some of the nature-based solutions that are out there that are possible for adapting to climate change. And so, Eric, I'm wondering now, you have recently submitted a proposal with a team of collaborators, including some staff from Raincoast, and you're proposing a suite of innovative habitat restoration projects. I'm wondering if you could give us an overview of those and describe what they're hoping to achieve.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just gonna bump my slides here. Perfect. All right, let's pop that one up. So we've put together this bit of a coalition here to try to implement some really meaningful habitat restoration and resilience projects in the estuary. So we've applied for some funding to this BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund, and so The Coles Notes version is it's a lot of money for different works across the province, and we've put in this proposal called the Fraser River Salmon Habitat or FRESH Restoration Projects. I was really excited when we came up with that title. Nothing beats a good snappy title there. And so we're partnering with 4 organizations here. So Ducks Limited Canada, working with Rain Coast Conservation Foundation, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, and Tsawwassen First Nation. And we've identified these 3 really key projects moving forward. We proposed 2 projects to address short-term habitat connectivity and quantity needs in the estuary, and 1 long-term resilience project that is more similar to that living dike. So I'll just briefly go over the first 2, and then I'll start talking about that third one, the Sturgeon Bank one, in a little bit more detail. So the first one is over at the Eelgrass National Wildlife Area. So we're over here at Westham Island. So this is, the George C. Rifle Migratory Bird Sanctuary, that area. If you've never been there, strongly would recommend it. Great place for bird watching. And just north of the sanctuary there's these 2 fields within the Federal National Wildlife Area. And these fields have historically been used for agriculture and whatnot. So they're diked. But the farming hasn't been so good there, so these fields have kind of been left alone. So Ducks Limited Canada has some funding to breach Field 9, and we've asked for some funding to also breach the dikes around Field 8 and to restore these areas to tidal marsh and restoring that brackish water flow. So not only is it a habitat restoration project, but it's also providing space for the marsh to move with sea level rise. And this is a form of coastal adaptation. So you can consider it managed retreat. Essentially, we're giving it back to nature. We're kind of retreating our lines in the sand, as it were, our boundary, and trying to restore these tidal environments. So that's the first one that we're hoping to get underway. And then some of you who may have heard Dave Scott share a bunch of the Rain Coast projects with respect to breaching that steep North Jetty I mentioned, that 9-kilometer long rock wall. So Rain Coast has done a fantastic job putting those breaches in, and we want to do more. So here we are over at the north arm of the Fraser River. So this is Iona Island, so Iona Beach, and this is the main Musqueam Reserve, and getting up to Point Grey and UBC here. And this north arm jetty is another rock wall that we want to put some holes in, and we want to enable it so that not only fish but also freshwater and sediments can flow into the foreshore there, and creating that access to these habitats where otherwise you can imagine small fish, they're about this size sometimes, they just get shunted right out into the Strait of Georgia. So having those off ramps, access to the habitat is really important. And then lastly, we have this idea called the Sturgeon Bank Sediment Enhancement Pilot Project. So this is one that I've been working with some folks over a few years. So Sturgeon Bank is the site of ongoing tidal marsh loss. So at this site, so we're at the west coast of Richmond here, if you can see my cursor there. And believe it or not, this site, at least 160 hectares of tidal marsh has died off since the 1980s. And we're not entirely sure why, although we have a good idea of different things that we can do to help support marsh growth. But so this was largely the topic of my master's research. And since then, we've been trying to rack our brains, what can we do to try to restore tidal marsh and to support tidal marsh resilience with sea level rise? Because it's such a big challenge here. Sorry, I'm just cycling through my slide deck here. So we've come up with this idea. So we were trying to think, how on earth could we get sediment to this location? Because it's a bit awkward. It's a bit far away from the dike, because the tidal marsh here is almost half a kilometer wide. So it's not nearly as narrow of a marsh as you have in Boundary Bay there. So originally we had this idea, well, what if you were to put a bunch of piles of sediment a few kilometers offshore? Would the waves and winds and currents be able to disperse that sediment to the foreshore marshes? And the modeling that was done pretty much said that's not really going to happen. So our lesson from that is, if you want sediment to go where you want marsh to grow, you essentially need to put it right in place. So we've come up with this really cool idea that I'm really excited about. So essentially, from the Fraser River annually, we dredge, I think it's something on the order of over 1 million cubic meters. It's probably a million cubic meters of sediment. We dredge it from the river and just dump it in the Strait of Georgia. And rather than dump it out there, let's repurpose it. So this idea has a dredge ship parking beside that jetty and then hooking it up to a floating sediment pipeline. So it's this pink line here. And you would deposit that sediment in these crescents. So first off, you deposit sand, so that's more coarse size sediment, into these kind of berms here. And these berms, I mean, they're only about 40 meters wide by 140 meters long. And they would provide an anchoring spot where then you could pump sediment of finer grain size. So that's your silt and your clays. You pump that into the area east of the berm, and the berm helps to direct those sediments toward the foreshore. But of course, you're also going to time that with the flood tide so that the water can distribute those very fine sediments that otherwise are shunted out into the Strait of Georgia there. So this is actually a graphical rendering that we made public. I think it was yesterday or the day before, so hot off the presses here. And so you get a sense of what we're looking at for these dredge piles and the potential area that this sediment could disperse. And so here you see a bit of a rendering of where we think the first spots to vegetate may be based on this sediment addition. And you can see that, if you were to add this sediment in small amounts gradually over multiple years, it allows these plants, these tidal marsh plants, to respond to that change in elevation, and you're really trying to mimic those natural processes there. And so you get a sense from this cross section here of that gradual expansion of the marsh that we're hoping for, but also how these established marsh will slow down waves, thus decreasing wave height, thus helping to drop out sediment, and then you don't have as much overtopping of your dikes, so potentially protecting our communities from sea level rise at the same time. So really the overall goal of this pilot project that we're proposing, again, we don't have money yet for it, but fingers crossed on that one, we want to demonstrate the biophysical response of the foreshore to sediment deposition with the aim of trying to restore receded marsh while also facilitating ecological resilience with sea level rise. So the idea here is to implement, adaptively manage, and evaluate the concept on a pilot scale, on a small scale, and if successful, we could potentially scale up such a concept to other areas of the Delta Front, potentially the entire western foreshore of Richmond or other sites in the Delta, such as Westham Island or Brunswick Point or something. So really, the way I like to look at this project, it's a win-win-win. We're able to reuse those dredged sediments to support both ecological resilience and coastal flood protection for our communities.
Wow, thanks, Eric. It's really inspiring, and it's really great to hear that there are win-win-wins out there. And I'm best of luck with the proposal, and I hope it goes through so we can see how this project goes and track it. I just want to provide a quick reminder for our participants. We've got about 15 minutes or so left in the episode. So if you have any questions for Debra, Eric, please feel free to pop them in the comments section and we will get to them shortly. But before we do, I would like to ask Deb just a quick follow-up question. And I know we briefly mentioned about this earlier in your presentation. It's really around the jurisdiction in colonial law, and which, you are a lawyer and have a lot of expertise around. And we know that the jurisdiction is often siloed and fragmented. Does this governance structure that we have in place make implementing nature-based solutions challenging? And what could we do to make it easier, essentially? And that's probably a really big question, but if you could unpack it a little bit for us, that would be great.
Thanks. It's also a lead-in question the way that you've asked it. If you want to go back to my presentation, sure. There's a slide that has the jurisdiction or kind of an overview of it. Yeah, that one. Thanks. And so, not expecting anybody to be able to read the fine print on this, but when we talk about jurisdiction, essentially we mean who's making the decisions and what are the rules that they're applying. And as it happens in Crown law and colonial law, so that's federal, provincial, and then local law, which is derived from provincial law, we've really kind of carved up the coastal area. So we have things going on land, we have local governments planning land use, and then they also now are responsible for flood management. So they're responsible for the dikes, but just up, the dikes are basically at the high water mark. And then beyond that, going seaward, local governments have relatively little authority. They can zone, but they haven't that. Most of the foreshore, if it isn't federal land here in the Lower Fraser, some of it is belong to and administered by the ports, but much of our foreshore is provincial Crown aquatic land, so the province manages that. And then as you get out into the water, then it's also a question of the marine laws with the federal government, and of course the Fisheries Act applies on the foreshore and in the water as well. And then we have environmental assessment legislation. We have some different laws around managing shipping, federal laws. We also have laws about sorry, I was just gonna zoom in here a bit. About making decisions in the foreshore on the part of the province. But none of this really works together as a system. It's all just based on managing different human colonial type activities and using these areas for human purposes. And what we really learned from Eric is that from a nature point of view, these are all systems that work together. The water comes down, the sediment comes down the Fraser, it spreads out over the delta, storms come in, they move the sediment around. Everything is working together. So we need to figure out a way to overcome all these, as you put it, Kristen, silos, and mimic that kind of systemic thinking about what's going on. So in Boundary Bay, again, Eric knows this very well because he's been representing the provincial government for us on this, but it's a wildlife management area. So the province has specific jurisdiction there. But this partnership now of the City of Surrey, City of Delta, and Semiahmoo First Nation is looking at undertaking these living dike pilots in this area. So that requires quite a bit of coordination. Similarly, the federal government is involved because DFO has interest, because there's fish habitat implications for doing that work. Environment Canada is interested because of the migratory birds issues. So there's lots of layers of government, and to help out with that collaboration, together with the Emergency Planning Secretariat, we've been facilitating a roundtable. So all the folks that have some jurisdiction have been coming to the roundtable and discussing the projects and supporting them as they go along. And we've been really, really fortunate to have Chief Harley Chappell from Semiahmoo First Nation be there. And I think in some ways really be a really good anchor for us all, because certainly something that we tried to reflect in this diagram as well is that from an Indigenous law perspective, the systems are recognized in the legal principles and in the law in a way that colonial law fails to do. But that's definitely been a strong support going forward. So the roundtable meets several times a year and has been really helpful in making that project possible. So otherwise, it would be a question of having to go knock on a bunch of different doors every time, every stage, every little decision that's being made. But this way, people are anticipating where it's going and participating in the design and really learning how to work together and think like a system of, you know, salt marsh and delta, and how does it all fit together. So it's been a really interesting process.
Yeah, and I have to say, it's been a great opportunity of bringing together the experts to, you know, creatively problem solve and figure out how to do it. And I know for me personally, it's been such a learning opportunity. And so these kinds of things, these don't happen that often, unfortunately, you know, and so they're so precious. But it's these kinds of things that we really need moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. thank you both for touching on the importance of collaboration and creativity and kind of thinking outside the box to solve or at least address, the ongoing challenges that we'll face with climate change. And thanks, Deb, for providing that framework and jurisdictional framework. I think it's important, to complement our understanding of the more technical sides of habitat restoration or living shores projects, but also to understand the governance that they sit within. So thank you for providing that. We have received some questions, and so I'm going to pop them on the screen just in the order that they were received, so both of you can answer them. So earlier we had a question from Leah, who asked, Eric, can you speak to what kinds of protections are provided by the wildlife management areas?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. So wildlife management areas are a type of provincial conservation land. So the Wildlife Act, the Provincial Wildlife Act, enables the minister to set aside land for the primary purposes of conserving and managing fish, wildlife, and their habitats. So it is, however, a flexible designation. So you can imagine, a place like Boundary Bay is also very popular for recreation. You have the beaches, both White Rock and Centennial Beach on the east and west respectively there. So additionally, there's other uses and potential traditional uses by different First Nations as well. So the WMA designation gives the essentially the statutory decision-making ability for the use of land or resources to the regional manager of fish and wildlife. So the management of such WMAs is guided by a management plan, which informs the regional manager's decision. So not like you need permission to go out walking there, just enjoy the sunshine kind of thing. That kind of thing is okay. But if, say, you want to conduct a research project where maybe you're transplanting vegetation, or say you're going to conduct some dike improvement works where your works will affect the ecosystems of the WMA, or say you want to make an access ramp to the beach that also goes into the WMA. All of those kinds of things require review and permission from that statutory decision maker. So it's like I said, it's a flexible designation. It also attempts to recognize some of the needs of the local community. Like we have some buried infrastructure in the Boundary Bay WMA. Like there's subterraneanly, there's the Crescent Beach force main line. So that's the sewage line that's actually buried underneath it. So sometimes, there's activities needed to service that. So definitely trying to recognize the needs of the community, but really everything is viewed through that primary lens of fish, wildlife, and habitat.
Gotcha. Great. Thanks for that. That was really helpful in understanding the different protections provided. We've had another question from Sean, who asked, will the marsh raising increase carbon sequestration through increased marsh lands? And I think either of you could answer that, but I think it's probably specific to the Sturgeon Bank project. So maybe we'll pitch it back to Eric, and then Deb, we have another question coming up.
So I would say the hope is yes, it would, but being a scientist, I would say we only know until we try. Because we're doing something that really hasn't been attempted here locally, and different tidal marsh communities can respond differently. Even specific plants can respond differently. So I would say that that is a co-benefit that's anticipated, but really we'll need research to be able to demonstrate that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Let's see, just going in order here, we have a question from John, and maybe
I think Debra wanted to mention, to respond to that one.
Please do.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add, some folks may have heard the term blue carbon. So that is the idea that these like marine vegetation essentially helps store and sequester carbon. And there's been some research done already in the salt marsh in Boundary Bay showing that it does store carbon, and it is sequestering carbon over time. And certainly it's hoped if the living dike were eventually scaled up to be a full project, that there would be enhanced enhanced salt marsh there so that there would be, more carbon sequestration as well.
Great, thanks. John asks, how much will the building of Roberts Bank Terminal 2 reduce the benefits of these proposed nature-based solutions? And I'll pitch that to either of you, whoever wants to take a stab at it. Or
Deb, you want to take that one first?
Maybe it's more directed to you, Eric, because that you can speak more specifically to what's in that region.
Yeah, sure. So for these nature-based solutions that we're currently proposing, they're not, well, clearly the areas where we're planning the pilot projects and all of that, they're not immediately adjacent to our RBT2. Also, we're focusing more on tidal marsh growth. And so RBT2, because it's quite far out in the intertidal, it's more likely to affect biofilm and some of the mudflats and subtidal ecosystems out there, as well as potentially affecting some sediment delivery south. But already the presence of Deltaport and the Tsawwassen ferry terminal really have fundamentally altered sediment delivery to that southern area. So it's already kind of inhibited sediment delivery. So typically with these nature-based solutions, because really the way to get support is to illustrate the co-benefits, those, like I said, win-win-win. And honestly, the easiest way to illustrate that is by doing that with, tidal marshes where you get, greater wave attenuation contribution. And so a lot of those areas aren't really directly where RBT2 is. They're closer to the foreshore, not so far out in the intertidal. But that being said, techniques like this Sturgeon Bank floating sediment pipeline could potentially be adapted to try to restore biofilm habitat. So where it's anticipated, from what I understand, talking with Environment Canada research scientists, that RBT2 will have some implications for biofilm, it is possible that we could use a floating sediment pipeline to deposit those fine-grained sediments that biofilm rely upon, and deposit that over large, vast areas and provide that elevation refuge for biofilm. So maybe there's ways in which our kind of nature-based solutions could be adapted to mitigate some of the effects of RBT2. But that's more speculation. I don't have a specific plan or drawing, so don't hold me to that. But I think for the Fraser Delta and talking about sea level rise, we're still very much at the brainstorming phase when it comes to solutions. Like, we're at the stage of coming up with cool ideas, trying them, evaluating them, monitoring them, and learning from that, adaptive management, trial and error. So I definitely think that there's space for out of the box thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah. Creativity is key. Deb, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I just was going to take it at a slightly different level. I guess the question and thinking about, what we're learning from the work in Boundary Bay is that these are very complex systems. We've heard a little bit about, that was a really good slide that Eric had about, how the way the Fraser River has changed, the way it used to come, part of it used to, thousands of years ago, empty into Boundary Bay. And still there are impacts in Boundary Bay from things going on the western side that, we don't really understand fully. We know it's a system, we know it's connected. So every time we start, taking a little part of what's still left away through something like T2, there's going to be an impact in the system. So it is potentially something that could affect the benefit of other types of nature-based approaches in the area. It's not like we can just fix everything. We're pretty short on what's left here, having already destroyed a lot of the existing habitat.
Absolutely. Great. And Deb, maybe in the last minute, Leah asks, is the roundtable you mentioned, the governance approach, well, she says it's so inspiring, which I agree. Do you see this approach gaining traction in other areas of BC? And we really only have a minute or so left. So if you could answer it quickly, that would be great. And I'll put it up here. Oh, I think you're back on mute.
Sorry about that. I think yes. I think we're learning lots of lessons, and we're hoping to share them with others. And I mean, roundtables aren't a new approach. We had roundtables for land use planning. We have other types of collaborative tables where people get together and build relationships and spend the time to figure out how to do things in a good way. And so I think that's one of the key lessons that hopefully we can share.
Definitely.
And just building on that, we're hoping with the Sturgeon Bank pilot project to work with Debra and other colleagues to do a similar roundtable. So, you know, no use reinventing the wheel. Why don't you just copy and paste the wheel, you know?
That's right. Collaboration is key. We unfortunately have run out of time, and I see there's other questions. If you would really like to get in contact with Deb or Eric with these questions, you can feel free to email me. Or our Raincoast email. It's on our website, and I can try and connect you with our guests today. So I just want to thank Deb and Eric for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. We've learned a lot. And just as a quick reminder, our next episode for this Connected Estuary webinar will be 2 weeks from now on May 12th, again at 12 p.m. Pacific time. And that episode will feature 2 bird conservationists who will discuss the importance of the Fraser Estuary to birds and the role it plays in a network of stopover sites that make up the Pacific Flyway. And they'll really build upon the information that Eric shared with us today about the importance of biofilm to foraging birds. So we hope that you will join us again in 2 weeks. Thanks again, Eric and Deb, for joining us today. So we will see you all soon. Bye.